We're so glad that Josh Shanley could be with us today. Josh draws on decades of experience with emergency response and management. In his early career as a firefighter-paramedic, he participated in the response to the World Trade Center attacks in 1993 and 2001. After earning his master's degree in emergency management in 2005, he built a successful career as a municipal emergency management director and served on several state boards and committees. He has since earned master's degrees in both entrepreneurial thinking and in education. He has worked widely as a consultant and educator in his field and is the author of 3 books: Connecticut Valley River Flood of 1936, to speak about today, Northampton Fires and Firefighting, and Cold War Massachusetts. His talk today is on the flood of 36, but will include comparisons to regional floods in other eras and in our valley. And I think he might also be prepared to comment on some of the water-related challenges that this area could be facing in the future.
Okay. Thanks, Eileen. Thank you, Eileen. Appreciate it. Thanks, everyone, for coming. I never know if anyone's going to actually show up at these things. So I've had rooms this size with one person, and then I just sort of sit down at a table and we discuss them. So thanks, everyone, for coming. I am dealing with a little bit of a challenge because this is not my technology, so I gotta switch over to, before I get too far.
Life is bare, blooming misery everywhere. Stormy weather, stormy weather. It keeps raining all the time. Stormy weather, stormy weather.
So 90 years ago today, it had been raining for 2 days straight. And people didn't know that it was going to rain for another 18 days. And it did. It rained for 20 days. And the video sets the stage for you all to understand that while we're going to be sort of talking about Holyoke and Chicopee, Northampton, Hadley, South Hadley, the sort of pin on the map, if you will, this was a regional event. This was New England plus. This was a huge event. I'm working on a second edition of the book, and it's really going to focus on Massachusetts because in my research, my ongoing research, I discovered that the Merrimack Valley has a lot more history, and so they were further along, and the damage was arguably exceeded what we had to deal with here. So I'm from Northampton, as Eileen mentioned. I grew up in New York City. I fell in love with a Northampton girl, and we've been together 30 years. So I was retired from the Northampton Fire Department after 13 years. So this is kind of my backyard in this area. Just for context, just day before yesterday, I was out with the Springfield, City of Springfield civil engineer, and he's taking me on tours of all of this infrastructure. So my research continues. The book was published 5 years ago, but I think I've done more research after the book was published than I did ahead of time. So what we're going to do is sort of just look at the 36 flood from the New England perspective, but very quickly get down to Holyoke. It's hard to focus on just one community when you're looking at these events because the river doesn't care where Holyoke starts and where West Springfield starts. So the river just does what the river does. This is Thomas Cole, and someone's going to help me with the title of the painting. I always forget. This is the Oxbow. It's a view of the Oxbow from Mount Holyoke, something along those lines. I got to get the title of it. But that's the Oxbow. And this, my wife graduated Smith in art history, so she always helps me understand what's going on in this photo. We could spend an hour talking about this, but essentially what this photo is showing, or the painting rather, what Thomas Cole was getting at is, well, first of all, the Oxbow, the river turns around that. In 1841, that neck is suddenly closed, or opened up rather, during a spring freshet. But what he's pointing out is the time moving on. We're on this side of the river, and you can see that it's an agrarian portion. So my work and my research really begins around 1800, and especially around after the War of 1812. There's a notable cultural business shift from working with the river, right? This indigenous people perspective, they just accepted that the river was going to go down. They moved close. In the spring, the river was going to come up and everyone moved back. The plains were part of the life. After the War of 1812, in this part of the river, business and culture started putting the river to work. And it was a notable change, and we started building closer and closer and closer to the river. So when there were flood events, and we had flood events, it was routine, it was just part of nature, there was more damage because we were building closer to the river. So after the War of 1812, there was a lot more industry using the river and building and working and living closer to the river. So that's why we started seeing more damage. So you can see industry happening here in Northampton and up into Leeds and that sort of thing. So it's more than a pretty painting, and it sets the stage for where we're going. So this is the South Hadley Canal. And again, it's hard to talk about one portion of the river without noting it. This was 1795. And when this canal was put in, and the dam in 1850, the Holyoke Dam, it changed things in my backyard up in Northampton. You couldn't put a dam and a canal in Holyoke and South Hadley without making a big impact in Hadley and Northampton. So when the canal and when the dam, this is 1795, the dam, the third dam, that's still there today, was finally put in, it changed the river upstream, most notably in Amherst in Northampton. But this was 1795, and it was pretty much the first notable event. And then I mentioned 1821, you get a gentleman, a businessman from Northampton, was petitioned Congress, the state Congress, to build a canal. I got to use my pointer here. To cut this channel, the Holyoke, or the Northampton, this is Hadley up here. He wanted to cut a channel, a canal, through the, what is ultimately the Oxbow. So this is what Thomas Cole painted. Joseph Lyman wanted to cut a canal there because he argued that it would save time, time is money, and depending on the time of year, became somewhat of an obsession for him. It was denied initially, and that was 1821. 1840, the river took care of it for him. So that's when the Oxbow was created. Spring freshet came through, looked very much like the 1936 event with ice, dams, and then a wall of water coming in and then pushing a covered bridge. And then finally the river just took the shortest route, which is what the river always does. So you can see there's a trajectory over time. The railroad also plays an important part in the development in the 1850s and going forward. The railroad is the business and the driving force at this point. So the river, where the river goes, the railroads tends to go next to it. And there's a lot of politicking and business around when the railroads are being built up the Connecticut. Are they going up on the east bank or the west bank? And that turns out to make a huge impact. At one point in Hadley, in the immediate aftermath, when they're doing the planning after the spring freshet that created the Oxbow, it was going to go up on the Hadley side. And then for geology and business reasons, they said, no, we're going to go up on the west side, which impacts Hadley to this day, leaving it a more agrarian culture and the business and industry on the Northampton side, arguably. It also turns out that and we have some more pictures of it, but the berms that the railroads are built on that go up the river also default to pretty good flood protection. Now, that comes back to bite us later on nowadays because it wasn't designed to be flood protection infrastructure, but it's serving in that capacity by default. I do a whole presentation. I'll be at the Forbes Library on Thursday. I'm here all week. Come back. But when I'm up in Northampton, I do kind of a tale of two cities between Northampton and Hadley because there were floods over time, 27 and then 36. And the way Northampton and Hadley responded to those floods with the infrastructure, the flood protection that they built is very different. I'll show you a quick photo. But that's all driven by the river, yes, but also the decisions that are going on when they're building railroads and they're building this infrastructure. So you can see that the canal was had been built for a short time, and then it was quickly replaced by the railroad. And that all impacts the flooding as well. So again, like geography, it's hard to stay focused just on flood. We need to be cognizant of the business and the other infrastructure that's going on around and being built at that time. The Mill River flood of 1874 was important to Holyoke, arguably, because in the aftermath of this flood, rather than rebuild up in Florence and Leeds and Northampton, many of these companies at this point said, no, we got a better deal. We're going to move down to Holyoke because the canals, the dam had been built in 1850 and the canals were now functioning and the mill buildings were up and the mill buildings and the canal was reaching out to businesses like this. So rather than start all over in these areas, a lot of the businesses along the Mill River in Florence and Leeds and Northampton came down here and they rebuilt on the canals because it was predictable. They could control the machinery. They could get a better handle on the business sense of what was going on in terms of, except for instead of waiting for rain and then the dams opening up and those sorts of things. So this was okay at the time, but after it was destroyed, many of these businesses relocated down here. You guys familiar with this flood? Yeah. Betty Sharp at Historic Northampton wrote the book on this one, literally. Fantastic presentation. She leads walks on this. That's just more Mill River flood. We just had the 150th anniversary of this flood a couple years ago. We did a whole reenactment of all that. So in 1927, and 1927 is another big flood when you start talking about these sorts of events. Similar weather pattern to Tropical Storm Irene in 2011. So very slow moving storm came up the Connecticut River Valley and parked itself in northern Vermont and then sat there and just rained and rained and rained. So this was a multi-day, multi-week event. The tributaries, the small rivers that feed into the Connecticut, they spike really quickly. And then as they go down really quickly, then the Connecticut picks up. So when we would run the City of Northampton Emergency Operations Center for flood events like Irene, we would watch. We'd have one screen with the Mill River, and it would spike. And we knew that there were 5 spots along the mill that would flood. They were predictable. And then they would go down, and then we would turn over to the other screen, and a day or two after, then the Connecticut would come up, and it would stay up for longer. And we have different infrastructure to respond to that that's built very differently. So it was important that we understood the weather patterns and the terrain, and also how the infrastructure works, so we could predict to the best of our ability. Fast forward to today, one of the things that I do, I work now with, and I'm not representing them here today, they all know what I do. When I start talking about history, most of my colleagues roll their eyes back. But I work now as a contractor for the Massachusetts Emergency Management Agency. So I'm still very much in touch with climate change and infrastructure and likely impacts that are going to affect us. So much of the infrastructure that was built in the aftermath of the 1936 flood was finally done around 1940, and certainly by 1941, we had shifted gears and no one was looking at flooding infrastructure. We had moved into the war, and that's why when you look at these projects, speaking to the gentleman, we were talking about some of the flood infrastructure. I still go and visit. There are plaques that are the stamped on the side, and they're all 1938, 1939, 1940. Very rarely do you see anything after that, and when you do, they're 1950, 55, because they sort of came back and started to reorganize. 1927 flood, though, big impact in Hadley, and you can sort of see it here. What they did in Hadley was they poured riprap, just big stones, in that top side of the first curve in the Connecticut River. And it's still there, and it is not in great condition. I work with the emergency manager, the fire chief, the town administrator, who happens to be the police chief in Hadley, and we're talking about how to mitigate the risk that this system was put in 1927. This keeps me up at night, and I don't live in Hadley. I live in East Windsor, so I'm up downstream. It keeps me up at night. When this thing goes, it'll impact everyone down here. Now if we go to 1936, again, the video covered this as we started to warm up, but it's important to understand the scope of this. This is March 20, which is arguably, March 20, 1936. It began on around the 10th, 11th, but the 20th is arguably kind of where the event peaks. And then the rivers start to recede, and then we're left with this big recovery phase. But March 20 is arguably where most people start thinking about just how bad the event is. And again, you have to keep in mind that people didn't have any sense of how long this was going to be going on. I have a lot of photos of people just looking into flooded streets after 3, 4, 5 days, and while it's still raining, there was no prediction. There was no saying how long this was going to go for. A lot of the stories, I collected a lot of stories and diaries, and there's scrapbooks there. People wrote about this stuff. It really impacted everything. There was nothing else going on at the time, and the sense of devastation is palpable in the photos of people and in the photos that they took and the way that they crafted these scrapbooks. It clearly made an impact far and wide. So again, you can start to see, this is what an infographic looked like in 1936, but you can start to see the scale of this flood and exactly how far and wide it was going. more of the same. Again, keeping in context what was going on in the rest of the world. Sometimes it's easy to get lost, not understand, where the rest of the world was at that time. I got a lot of the research for my book in these journals that were put together by the New England, what is it? New England Power Association. These were trade journals, and they responded to many of the events here. The infrastructure for electrical energy was just being built at that time. Many communities didn't have any. The communities that did have it, it was shaky at best, but there were power plants, and they were built right along the river. They were being basically put in place in the places where the mills had been, because the mills were used to turn turbines, and in this case they were used to cool the plants in some cases and just generate electricity. That was just the mindset at the time. So with these power plants being built, they were being devastated by the floodwaters, and in a lot of cases with the ice chunks, they were just plowing into these buildings very slowly over time, over a period of days, and just pushing them off their foundations very slowly. You just get a better sense of how widespread this is. In addition to the flood, in addition to the infrastructure disruption, it's important to remember that this was a public health crisis as well. This was leading to famine because milk was being transported on trains in tankers, and if the milk couldn't get to where it needed to go, it was stalled, and then it would spoil, and then there was no backup plan to get milk from Vermont down to Boston. So if it didn't get there, people were going hungry. All right, so it turned into it started to evolve into a much more complicated event. And again, from my professional perspective as an emergency manager, we start recognizing these cascading events. If you think about Katrina, started as a hurricane, the flood infrastructure failed, the city of New Orleans is built below grade, the city filled, and the pumps couldn't get the water out of the city, turned into a public health and ultimately a real disaster in terms of the ability to get food and water and take care of people. So this is what started to happen in many of the small towns, not only in Massachusetts, but all over New England. They were isolated, they were cut off. They couldn't get food, they couldn't get fresh water in some cases. The water tables became contaminated, or at least they were expected to be contaminated, because the floodwaters turned into what we would call today a hazmat, right? There's all sorts of oil and water and chemical debris that is now in the drinking water system. So the public health folks are rightly telling people not to drink the water. So what are people supposed to do? This becomes a very complex problem that's really difficult to resolve. Information, getting information, it makes me think of what's going on, today, modern day, where we get our information. But is it safe? Is it not safe? It's all conflicted. It's coming from different sources. It's coming at a much slower rate in this case, but it's still difficult to wrap your head around what's going on. In this case, there was a high point of the event came when the Vernon Dam, which is on the Connecticut just north of the Vermont border, that was a big concrete dam that was designed to hold back and turn turbines. So not flood control necessarily, but designed to turn turbines to create electricity. There was a big concern that if that dam was to give, if the Vernon Dam failed, suddenly there's a wall of water coming down the Connecticut River without any sort of warning, right? So we have, I'll back up to the Mill River flood of 1874. That was a man-made industrial pond with a man-made dam that was released on a time basis to turn mills at that point, right? That failed suddenly, and the devastation was horrific. The concern that if the Vernon Dam failed, it would be even worse because it's a bigger dam, more water, faster, less notification. So the state police at that time out of the Northampton barracks were monitoring this, and they had a line of communication directly up to the dam. They had a wire, a phone wire that went up to the dam. They lost the communication with the dam, and the assumption was for a period of time that the dam failed, and they were waiting for a wall of water to come down into Northampton and then continue on. Turns out that wasn't the case, but there was a period of time where they were really trying to figure out what was going on. Again, going back, I think I'm going to turn this thing into a screenplay one day. The stories that they tell in this around the crew that was staffing the Vernon Dam and what they were doing to keep that from failing, opening gates, shutting down electricity. It was a crew of about 12 guys who were just dedicated to making sure that that didn't fail. That was their job. I have some old interviews with the engineers who were in there at that time, and it was it must have been like Hollywood crazy in that place. They're breaking windows, it's pouring into the station, there's arcing wires. Guys are going across the power lines on some sort of trolley device because they couldn't get it across the river any other ways. Similar stories on different scale with the Deerfield River. I'll be up in Greenfield in a couple weeks talking about the Greenfield River, or the Deerfield and the Millers River. Those are, again, these tributary rivers are arguably more exciting because stuff's actually happening. But a point of real contention in this particular event on March 19th was that the dam had broken, and it took a trooper actually going up in that direction to confirm what they ultimately found out to be untrue, fortunately. So we'll start dialing in a little bit more to Holyoke specifically, and also the aftermath of the flood. Again, it rained for 20 days, and there have been other floods, right? There are plenty of other floods going back further. I have a couple other graphics I show. Back into the 1600s, we started measuring floods. Measuring floods early on was more anecdotal. The flood came this high, and you see notches on houses and things like that because we didn't have the gauges that we have now. Somewhere around 1900 is when the USGS, the Geological Survey, came in and started putting in meters so we could measure them and keep track of them. But right around this time, there were definitely places along the Connecticut River and along the tributaries that just were still documenting the height of the flood, based on notches in the signs. If you've been, does anyone know where some of these flood markers are?
Yeah.
Where? 47 in Hadley. Yep, that's a good one.
All right, the question, where was, at that timeline, when was the Holyoke Dam constructed?
1850, right? 1850.
Okay, so
Yep. So this is Connecticut River flood at Holyoke. So keep in mind that the dam is there. There's flooding on the Connecticut, and they're opening and closing the dam. But in 1936, in the aftermath of 1936, you're never going to see these numbers again because the infrastructure is built now to control it. Now, my position is that it was built, in 1940, and it largely wasn't maintained. And I do this work all up and down the valley and even more out east now. These systems were put in by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and then handed over to the local municipalities. There was no contract that the Army Corps is responsible for them after that. It's a gift to you, no backsies. They're moving away. And we see that over and over and over again here in Holyoke, but everywhere. Holyoke's not unique in this regard. So these flooding patterns changed dramatically after, say, 1940 because the infrastructure is built now. But going back to my earlier point about the changes in the agrarian versus industrial approach, people are now living very close to the river. The factories are built right on the rivers, especially on the tributaries. People are living in these communities that when the communities flood, people are just, they're decimated. They lose their housing, they lose their jobs, they lose everything. Everything is built very close to the river at this point. So in the aftermath of the flood, FDR is president, and he puts a lot of these New Deal efforts into the recovery process. So there's a lot of legislation. Again, keep in mind this is a large-scale event into not only New England but into New York, arguably portions of Ohio down into Pennsylvania. This is a large area that's been impacted, and this is not the only flood. This is just our flood. So there's a lot of changes at the federal legislation level that recognize where we are and accepts the fact that a big investment needs to be made in terms of building resilient flood protection infrastructure. Again, not just for the river, but you need to think about these things holistically. So the river floods, what is it doing to our farmland? What is it doing to our businesses and industry? We're still dealing with these issues today if you pay attention to what's going on with flooding. Now, Irene in 2011 and storms in 2023 decimated farmland, depending on where they were. And local farming is important. You got a seed share going on right outside there now. Those people think local farming is really important. So understanding that and keeping it in context, along with all of the other critical infrastructure, the transportation infrastructure. In many cases, it's still the case that our state highways are built running along the side of our rivers, right? We get Route 5, we get the smaller rivers up in Franklin County in the Berkshires. You have Route 8. In 2011, the Chickley River was destroyed, and it took out Route 8, which if you live in Hawley, Mass., if you live up in that area, that was more than an inconvenience. Those people were cut off for days and in some cases weeks when Route 2 and Route 8 were just washed away into these rivers that they were built to run parallel to. So thinking about these things holistically is important, and they were starting to do this in 1936. And it's easy to look back and appreciate the way they were approaching these things. At the same time, there was immediate need for recovery. So funding was coming in from the feds to fund the people that had been displaced to start rebuilding. They weren't rebuilding at this point. They were still very much in recovery mode. But you can see, again, this is coming out of DC, and the president is beginning to understand the scope of the problem and talking about working with the Red Cross and those kinds of things. Apparently it was bad enough that he even deferred his fishing trip. I don't know if that would happen today. I'm just saying. I don't know. Much of the research, in addition to the Power Association, came from this report, and this was published in 1937 by the U.S. Army, USGS. And I think this is 800 pages of riveting material. So if you can't sleep at night, this is next to the bed. So when I can't sleep, I pull this thing out. And this is only volume 1. So, but what I wanted to call your attention to was that even at that point, and this was just a year after, it was from an evaluation of known historical records together with evidence furnished by the texture, structure, thickness, and position of recent flood sediments and materials associated with them, it is concluded that no flood as great or greater than that of March of 1936 has visited Massachusetts portion of the Connecticut Valley since civilization began there, and probably not for several hundred years prior to that time. Although there is no reason to believe that an equally or more severe flood could not occur at any time in the future, the chances for such an occurrence at any time appear to be small. So they had some perspective of recognizing the significance of this flood event, and they appear to be optimistic that it won't happen again. And honestly, it hasn't. It hasn't. The flood infrastructure that was built in the aftermath of this one has been doing its job. It's easy to get sort of carried away and think about, there's a ticking time bomb in everyone's community. It's not that dramatic. These systems are going to sort of fail over time, one at a time, piecemeal. That's the way I tend to look at them. Here's a different timeline of historic flooding events on the Connecticut. So again, you can see that, when we arrived shortly thereafter, we started tracking these things. But these are just notable events. Back to March of 36. Here's Holyoke. So it's important, and forgive me if there's the run of the river, 410 miles. There's Hartford up to, I think that's White River Junction. So that's not 400 miles. That's a good chunk in the middle. Here's Holyoke, Hartford, this Vernon, Vermont, Turner's Falls. Same flood event, but the river changes its width, its depth, and that impacts the volume and the speed of the flood. So volume, turns out, is not as bad as the velocity. So when you get water moving faster, it's going to do more damage. So you can see a lot of water going up very high and moving very slow. It's going to do some impact of damage. But when you get this erosion and you're getting all this undermining of the soil, that's where the real damage happens, it turns out. So that's why you can see during the same event, at the same time, the flood heights are different. So in Holyoke is different from Hartford, et cetera. But I argue that coming through the notch at Mount Tom is where a lot of the damage happened, because the ice chunks were allowed to build there because it gets very narrow and not so deep. So they are coming down the Connecticut from the north towards the south down the river, and these chunks of ice the size of cars are creating a dam. And the water then builds up behind it, and then they suddenly give and they create this wave of water, then they build up again. So it's not just once, it happens on an ongoing basis. Here's a comparison of the 36 flood in 1938. So 1938, it was the hurricane of 38, comes up the Connecticut River Valley. We almost had an event like this in 2021 with during Umberto came up, and almost one of the patterns had it coming up the Connecticut River Valley. So we're in the middle of COVID, and I'm watching CNN, and one of those spaghetti projections has it coming up in the 1938, the Long Island Express hurricane pattern. And I was probably the only one paying attention to flood hurricane patterns at that point. But anyway, many people, when I start talking about this and they don't have the context, start thinking about the 1938 hurricane. And that was a good one. But most of the damage that was done during 38 was from wind, very high winds. 36 was a spring freshet. The winter and going into the fall, or the fall going into the winter of 1935 was especially cold. There was a lot of snow, and then there was a sudden thaw, and then these 20 days of rain. So that was what led up to this flood event. 38, hurricane comes up the Connecticut River Valley. Hadn't happened before, hasn't happened since. Tremendous amount of wind knocks down many trees and destroys communities. But in terms of a flood event, it gets close, but the flood doesn't last as long. So if anyone starts to argue with you about 38 versus 36, which was worse, you call me. Again, starts to look at the depth of the river and the width of the river at different points. So what you're looking at here is normal low water in 1913, and then the flood crest in 36 versus 38 at different points in the river. So if you're familiar with the river in Turners, it actually gets very shallow. There's another canal system up there, but it gets very shallow. So the water is going to go up higher, as opposed to Holyoke, where it's a little deeper. There's falls here, obviously, but the geology changes the pattern, and that impacts the overall height of the river. So you can see where the river was at different points. The height of the flood was at different physical points along the river. Again, 36 versus 38 compared to a normal, or what they determined normal in 1902 and 1903. This one, I'm a wannabe graphic artist, so I appreciate that someone actually drew this. This is, and what you're looking at here, again, these are dates going to 1936, including 1938, and the depth of the river, and then the precipitation in inches. So you can see how 36 stands out in terms of both precipitation and in the flood level. A lot of information in there. And then again, this is just a page out of the USGS report talking about the Holyoke Dam. And essentially the height of the flood waters was on March 20. I already started talking about this, but the Flood Control Act of 1936 was the legislative push, the response from the federal government saying, all right, this needs to be addressed. But this was really just the beginning of it. Flood control, it turns out, it gets very political. Because again, going back to what we talked about when we're looking at Joseph Lyman wanting to cut a canal that ultimately is done by the Oxbow for him. And when Holyoke puts in the dam, and when South Hadley builds the canal in 1795, they can do that, and that's fine for their communities, but it arguably created big change in South Hadley, or in Hadley and Northampton upstream. So very political. This gets heated, and there's a lot of money at stake in terms of agriculture being destroyed. All of these issues around the business and the industry and the ecology of these communities. So you can't just make a decision on the river in your community and not expect to get feedback both upstream and downstream. And these get contentious. These conversations do get contentious. So the Flood Control Act was not just focused on New England. These were all of the projects that were being built in the aftermath of the 1936 Flood Control Act. Tennessee Valley Authority, TVA, was another one, arguably bigger than ours, but it was collected in the same program. Start talking about politics here. This is what my bookshelf looks like. Books from 1950 something about the flood control politics. But you can just get a sense of when these systems come in to a community and the issues that come up around them. It's very complicated. I know we're looking at battery storage and data storage conversations now. They pale in comparison to this. People got animated, people got angry around these things. You had farmers versus industrialists, and who owned the land and who could control when the water was released, et cetera. So looking at Holyoke again, here's some of the flood protection that was built in the aftermath. So this is damage that was sustained during the flood along the river, and then this is the flood protection infrastructure that was built in the aftermath. So this is down by the canals. I have a map, I'll show you where it is, but does everyone essentially know where this is? Down by the canals from the dam, working down towards West Springfield. This is one of the pump stations. I'll show you a map in just a minute of where these stations are built. So what I'll point out to you though here is that this was one of the pump stations. This is a concrete flood wall, and then this is earthen levee. So there's at least 3 layers, of critical infrastructure that are being built in there. Obviously, there's everything else within it. But when I start to think about these systems, I start to look at the flood walls, the earthen levees, and then the pump stations. Holyoke has 7 pump stations. But this is a really neat before and after. And as a photographer and a historian, I appreciate the guy that went out and did the before and after. He had to really think about setting up these perspectives, and he got it pretty good. There's the Connecticut there. Some more damage. Just to give you a scope of it. This is the Chicopee system. These systems were built, they're bespoke. Every community has a custom-built flood control infrastructure that was built by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and then handed over as a gift while they backed away. It's important because as these systems they're aged now. These are 90 years old, right, in some cases, or 85 years old. Again, you see the same system. You see the concrete flood wall. You'll see this earthen dam. Here's the earthen levee, rather, and then this riprap. I just looked at this when I was coming across. But this starts to speak to the complexities of fixing these systems. There is no one-stop fix to these. Each needs to be designed and built custom to the area. And that costs money. These systems, the one I'm paying closest attention to right now is in Northampton, the Hockenham wastewater treatment plant, Hockenham Road. One flood control building, 3 pumps from 1940 in an old brick building. In 2023, they almost lost that building. 2 of those pumps failed, and the third one lost the electricity to the fuel supply. And they were about 15 minutes away from losing all of that infrastructure. Now, that's not to say that this is not the Vernon Dam scenario. This is not the Mill River Dam scenario, where a wall of water comes pouring into the city. In those scenarios, if those flood control systems fail, like you have here, if all of them were to fail, it's going to be a slow event. The city is going to begin to fill with water at its lowest points. All right, so I just want to be clear on that. This isn't like a catastrophic sudden failure. But if it's not managed over time, the bowl in Northampton, if you're familiar with Lower Conn Street, if you get off exit 18 where the bowling alley is and now there's a roundabout, that's the lowest point in the city. If that pump station fails, that area is going to fill up steadily over a period of days. And then until they fix it, or fix those pump stations, that water's got nowhere to go. So there's a bowl effect that goes on in there. That's not exactly what you would have going on here, because this system's built along the canal, so it would be very different. Again, it just takes, you have to go into these things understanding the systems and understanding how they were built, and then understanding what's going to happen if they fail. This one was completed later. This was at 65, so they started it and then came back after the war. I'm going to move along through some of this so we can keep an eye on time here, but talk about Hadley, South Hadley, the bridges. So the bridges are a good example. Many, many, many bridges were washed away, hundreds of bridges. And the response to replacing the bridges was much more simple. So these iron bridges that you see going over the tributaries, right? They were, it was easier to make a template for those, build them with that erector set type of construction, and then build them much more quickly. They are now beginning to fail. So if you're familiar with some of those, the the bridges that were built. If you stop and take a look at the dates, which is something that I do, my wife can't stand it, but you start to look at the dates on those bridges, and they're all like 38, 39, because they were all put in pretty rapidly, built by a company in Berlin, Connecticut. But the flood protection infrastructure is separate and much more complicated and expensive. So again, just to paint the picture here of what was going on during the social and cultural impact of this flood during the recovery. A lot of comparisons to 1927 because that had been the most recent flood. So this is the flood waters actually going over the top of the dam, which engineering friends have told me is a really bad thing. It either undermines it or it comes up over the top. But either way, when you get to this point, if a dam is overtopped, it does potentially significant damage. And I talked about this, but there was another channel. This is Northampton and Hadley, but this channel was created in the 1936, separate from 1941, and the track of the river continues, but this leads to a lot of flooding in Hadley nowadays. This is up at the Mount Tom at the Notch. So you can see that those are the ice chunks I was talking about. That's the Route 5 bridge. And there's some of that electrical infrastructure that was newly installed at that point. But you get a sense of just how, what it looked like. And also when reading these articles and doing the research, the sound was, it was notable. They were trying to describe it, but it would just echo. It would just pierce, and it sounded very sharp, and it would just resonate off the mountains. And apparently it was remarkable enough that there are many, many comments written about it in some of these journals. This I thought was an interesting response. So they were actually flying planes over, lighting sticks of dynamite and dropping it onto those ice chunks there. What could go wrong? And I'll start wrapping up. But here's what your system here in Holyoke looks like now. Whoops, this is GIS data. But, I got it, thank you. The home stretch. These are your flood walls here in the light blue, and your earth embankments here. And there's an overlap. So there was one picture where this is built into the earthen embankment. And in some cases, they build flood walls on top of the earthen embankments. So they're not mutually exclusive. You don't have one or the other. And then you have your pump stations here. Here are the canals, obviously, and the dam. It's up. The dam's up here somewhere. Yeah, up here. So here are your flood pump stations. You have 7 of them. And what they do is just pump water that when the river reaches a certain threshold, these pumps turn themselves on, and they pump water back into the system. Yes, sir?
And does it help that there's a second Holyoke dam, the wooden dam above it?
Good question. I'm not sure about that. That's a great question. I don't know.
It's still not collapsed. I mean, it's still there.
Yeah, I don't know. That's a good question. What I do find is that people like yourself understand that level of detail. I'm zoomed out, and I'm trying to now zoom into each community. I was telling the gentleman I was down with the civil engineer from City of Springfield, and we were way into some of these systems. And guys like that, they're the ones who know where, what keeps them up at night. So understanding those details matter. Yeah. I don't know the answer to the question, though. But anyway, this is what your system looks like now. There's a similar, this is the Chicopee side. And so what the pink area is the predicted area that is being protected by these flood walls and these pump stations. So if these weren't here, when the Connecticut reached flood stage, these areas would be impacted directly, quickly, naturally. So that's what the different indicators are around here. Similar on the Holyoke side. And then I have most of the communities detailed now similarly. I think I'm just about done. Yeah. Thank you. Please, you had a question, man. Sorry.